Hello and welcome to this event. I'm Shahid Bari, Professor of Fashion Cultures and Histories at LCF, and I'm chairing our discussion today on evaluating placemaking and creative co-production. Now, this event is hosted by the Social Design Institute at UAL. As you may know, the Social Design Institute champions research and practice in social design and design for sustainability. It uses research to inform and challenge how designers and organizations design, making a positive social and environmental difference. Now, this event today focuses on design initiatives that are centered on placemaking and creative co-production. And we're specifically thinking about how to evaluate the various outcomes of projects like these, whether we're working with different institutional structures, community groups, local government, arts organisations, foundations and businesses, as many of us do. How we go about measuring our success or assessing our challenges will vary. And today we'll be hearing from four different projects, trying to share some good practice and thinking out loud about issues we've come across. Now, do feel free to comment as we talk in the chat box, but if you'd like to ask a question too, please enter that in the Q&A box and we'll try our best to get to some of them at the end of the session. Now, let me start by introducing our speakers. They are Patrycja Kaczynska. Patrycja is a senior research fellow at the Social Design Institute and a research associate of culture at King's College London. She's worked in policy research for Westminster-based think tanks, among others. She first turned to cultural value as a project researcher for the AHRC Cultural Value Project, and then she was a project manager for the Cultural Value Scoping Project, and she's now leading the valuation work for the Social Design Institute at UAL. And her interests are at the cross-section of critical theory, cultural studies and design. Hello, Patrycja.
Hello, great to be here.
Lovely to have you. Tessie Britton is the founder of Participatory City Foundation, an innovative practice that prototypes new ways to support practical participation. She's editor-in-chief of Community Lovers Guide, a crowdsourced project gathering hundreds of case studies of participatory culture projects from across the world. And she works on a number of international projects, including supporting Bloomberg Philanthropies, Mayor's Challenge and New Radicals with Nesta. She's a guest lecturer at many institutions, and she's led a new education MA module at Chichester University on metacognition and well-being in schools. Hello, Tessie.
Hi, good morning.
Lovely to have you. Morning. Bethany Rex is a Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow at the Centre for Cultural and Media Policy Studies at the University of Warwick. She has a background in arts and museum studies, and her doctoral research considered the relationship between government policy and museum practice, which I think many of us are interested in, and particularly the shift towards localism, of which I think we might hear some more. Bethany's worked as a research fellow at UAL on the Creative Lenses project, exploring the business models of arts and cultural organisations, and her work now centres on publicly subsidised culture and the impact of austerity on communities and the voluntary sector in public service provision. Hello, Bethany.
Hi, morning. Really happy to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great.
Thanks.
Katrina Foxton is an independent researcher and part-time heritage officer. Working alongside Bethany, she co-authored the Locally Rooted report, funded by Power to Change, which explores community asset transfers, or CATs. Her interests are in heritage, community engagement and values, and she's particularly fascinated by the different experiences of being in places and the connections and disconnections between heritage management and placemaking. She's currently, among other things, the Heritage Officer for the lottery-funded Parks for People project at Staunton Country Park. Hello, Katrina.
Good morning, and hello to everyone online as well.
Lovely to have you. And Kim Wide. Kim Wide is founder, CEO and artistic director of Take a Part. Kim started in museums and collections at the City of Toronto and government of Ontario Art Collection before moving to the UK to work at Art Sway, a contemporary gallery in the New Forest, and Kaleido, the arts development agency. She initiated Take a Part with the Efford community of Plymouth in 2008, and this pilot project grew into an international programme of work, with Take a Part receiving National Portfolio Organisational status in 2018. Kim is a Claw Fellow, among other things, and she received an MBE in the 2020 Queen's New Year's Honours List for services to social engagement in the arts, the first time ever social practice has been honoured on this level. Congratulations, Kim. Hello.
Thank you. Hello, Julia. Hello, everyone.
It's lovely to have you all. That's lots of talking from me. Let's hear from you guys. We're going to be talking about evaluation, but let's start with values first, if we may. If you were only allowed to select two, what would you say are the key values, qualities, or outcomes that you're looking to measure or assess in your projects? I know that's a hard question, but do your best. Patricia, you go first.
This is not an easy question at all, because for me, preempting what you are looking for is a problem to start. I'm interested not in value as such, as valuing and value co-production as activities. And if you start with an activity rather than a preconceived idea of what value is, you arrive at much a more rich and pluralistic account. So certainly more than a couple.
I think we're going to get to that. The difference between valuing and value. That sounds really interesting. Tessie, what about you? Can you come up with a couple at least? I think Patricia sort of sidestepped the question there.
Obviously, I want to sidestep it as well. I think what we've been trying to do really is understand how outcomes are created through peer-to-peer interactions in practical activity. So we think that that's really the sort of the thing which is really important. And there's a whole raft of outcomes that we think we're trying to figure out what they are and how they get created. And so I think it's really how this kind of activity promotes or creates outcomes, in the same way that you would want to see how a specialist service might create outcomes for recipients. In this case, we want to see what peer-to-peer impacts get created and what value comes from that.
Thank you. You didn't sidestep there. Bethany, what about you?
Well, I guess I would answer this question just slightly differently as a researcher rather than, you know, someone initiating projects. So I guess it is a really, really hard question, and I would try and sidestep it if I sort of had a clever phrase to be able to do that. But I think key qualities I'm looking for in my research, I guess I try and resist a kind of solutionist approach. So I try and make space to investigate problems rather than responding to the kind of demand to find a solution as a researcher, because I think that that's not entirely in my power. So that's something that I try and do. And I guess maybe in common a little bit with what Tessie just said, I try and use methods which enable participants to meet one another. That's something that we did in the Locally Rooted project, and just kind of using the research as a platform to enable new connections with people working on similar issues, facing similar challenges, I think is really satisfying. So that's my answer.
That's really interesting. I think we need to talk more about that too, about getting our participants to meet each other and how evaluation allows that. Katrina.
Hiya, yeah, so I feel a little bit strange in that I have many hats that I wear, in one sense because I'm a researcher, but in the other sense I'm actually having to evaluate for the lottery and my park job, so guilty of having to fall in line with their objectives. But I think one of the strands that threads through all of this for me is trying to capture or bring to the surface people's own understandings and impressions of changing of their own values and their own perceptions of particularly the places that they are committed to. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it, actually, just their impressions.
I think we're already seeing how complex this picture is of how to capture value already. And Kim.
Hi, yes. I suppose my interest, because I again don't like to predict the outcomes, I have more of a longitudinal relationship with the communities I work with. I'm really interested in community ownership and ambition as a driver. And most importantly for me in working with the communities I do, I want to see a shift in the historic and systemic social injustices that these places have tended to have over a long period of time. So looking at values around employability or education and skills development, and activism as well.
Great. Oh, that sounds really interesting. I'm going to want to ask you more about that. Okay, so this is going to be a complicated discussion, I can see, but I think it'd be really good to hear from each of you about your projects in detail now and to learn a little more about your experiences of evaluating placemaking and creative co-production. Patricia, you're starting us off.
Many thanks, and I'm ready for my slides, Lynn, whenever you are. Let me start by introducing myself, that I'm a philosopher and an art historian by training, and I think that's significant in relation to my approach to evaluation. There's this idiom, can't see the wood for the trees. And I think it's often the case in evaluation that a lot of attention is paid to the meticulous counting of individual trees, which of course is important, but the nitty-gritties of calculation get in the way of seeing the shape of the entire wood. And I'm interested in the general shape of things, and I start with understanding how we value, and only then how we measure, how we should measure or capture. And this informed my evaluation of make. I'm ready for my second slide. Make. Make at Story Garden is a public space for creative collaboration in Somerstown and St. Pancras in central London. It is a partnership between Somerstown Community Association, London Borough of Camden, Central St. Martin's, University of the Arts London, and the developer's Lendlease. The physical space comprises 2 public workshop spaces, which are effectively reused shipping containers, which offer specialist tools and expert resources. And if you look at the top left-hand photos, you see those containers. Make is located within the Story Garden, which is a temporary garden run by the charity Global Generation on the site owned by the British Library. And if you look at the top right-hand photo, you will see the outdoor space and the making that took place. The aim of the space is to bring together local people, art school students and staff, and other organizations interested in using the space to work together on a program of arts and design activities addressing local issues and skills development, in particular in Somerstown Estate. The space is open to booking from community groups, arts organizations, and residents within the area, even though the majority of activities were delivered and developed by Central St. Martin's and the team led by Adam Thorpe, who is a professor of socially responsive design. The photos 3 and 4 at the bottom show you examples of the kind of activities that would be housed in Make. So there's the Day of the Dead, the day of community takeover, and also one of the activities organized by Central St. Martin's by one of the graduates who was interested in weaving, hence joy in weaving. Right, so Make opened in July 2019 and continues from spring 2021 under management of a local community association. So this is the project. This is Make. This is the project I was tasked with evaluating. I'm ready for my second slide. So draft report from the evaluation is now with my colleagues who will oversee the production process. We hope that the report will be available in the summer. For now, to give you just a preview of my executive summary. So what has emerged from this evaluation activity? Well, first point is pretty straightforward. 1,694 people who engaged in Make's 189 activities and events over the period from July 2019 to January 21 benefited in a number of ways. For instance, 98 of those who participated in the facilitated activities felt happier, 94 more creative, 92 more confident directly after participating. Make also positively impacted people's feeling like a part of community and understanding people who are different from oneself. Make stimulated interest in arts participation and supported work readiness. So far, so good. What else? Make promoted an open-ended way of cross-institutional working. What does it mean? Make build relationships between the individuals involved. And because those individuals are institutionally embedded, this carried over into building operational capacity across organizations. This created opportunities for possible ways of working in the future. So just to note that this goes beyond the narrow delivery of instrumental outcomes through Make. This is more future looking already. Next, Make can be framed in multiple ways, and the choices of perspectives influence how we see its value. So we have looked at how place-based interventions are framed differently from different institutional points of view. So emphasis can be put on the local council's need to address complex public service delivery challenges. So Make can be a sort of community hub, if you like. A more business perspective would see Make as an instance of multiple helix innovation and a living lab. But Make can also be approached as just a makerspace. And to some extent, Make was all of them, even though they frame value quite differently. So here we're getting to see that Make is complicated. And it gets even more complicated because my next point is that Make is an enduring relational, socio-technical platform and not a project. What does it mean? This means that Make is a structure bringing people together, resources, and policies, drawing on the well-established traditions of participatory design and co-design and the work of Public Collaboration Lab at CSM. Make can be presented as an instance of continuing design, meaning that rather than finished products or services, what is being designed persists by being adapted and used through time and over time. And this leads me to perhaps a striking finding from the evaluation activity, that is, Make is underpinned by latency and not efficiency, with its key accomplishment consisting of the co-creation of value. To unpack this a little, rather than ameliorating problems and targeting needs, Make works to promote the development of different capabilities in different people, depending on what kind of contribution they are prepared to make. So value is created over time and depends on how people interpret the kind of opportunities they are confronted with and how they experience and influence change over time. And this all adds up to saying that Make aims at creating opportunities rather than actualizing narrow impact, with some of the potential produced remaining latent and possibly never being activated. And lastly, Make should be evaluated in terms of service-dominant logic, not outcome-based performance monitoring. I'll not go into this in any detail. Service-dominant logic is an idea originating in marketing and management and increasingly popular in policy, which amounts to a different paradigm of value production and articulation. Essentially, value is not about one individual selling stuff to a different individual, but rather about collectives interacting together and working together. So rather than about efficiencies, value is about alignment within institutional, organizational, and communal ecosystems. So value is here conceived less in mechanical and functional terms of meeting fixed objectives and more organically as something evolving. A good, I think, metaphor for that is the snowball effect. And I think this is the right framework for understanding the value of Make. And this brings me back to the shape of the wood that I started with. This is roughly the right kind of shape for that. And now probably all of you are curious about how on earth you capture this, but I'll stop now because I suspect that's one of Shahida's questions to me.
Exactly so, Patricia. That was fascinating. Fascinating to understand the mechanics of a project, how working with people, with 1,694 people who engaged with 189 events from July 2012 to January 2021, how that is to be converted into some sort of metric. I wonder if my question is about your characterization of Make as an enduring relational socio-technical platform, rather than a project. So
Mm.
what are the challenges? How do you go about measuring an enduring relational socio-technical platform when it's not a project?
The challenges associated are significant, not just because of the nature of the project, which is very, very interesting and indeed based on design principles of infrastructuring. I'll not go into this right now here, but the challenge was that Make had partners and sponsors who wanted to find out whether the investment was justified. So there were 6 objectives set, and what evaluation, among other things, had to do is demonstrate to what extent Make met those objectives. So in the approach articulated, there were effectively 2 different strands. One I called a retrospective one that was grounded in a log frame approach that used very traditional way of mapping indicators against those objectives. So that's pretty much bread and butter of evaluation for you. But the prospective strand, the second one, was one anchored in outcome mapping approach. And it was pretty obvious to all of us from the beginning that using just a log frame approach, and here I'm assuming that people are more or less familiar with what that is. It's yes, it is effectively a way of fixing indicators, the kind of things you want to measure against preset objectives. So working with this approach was not sufficient to understand the value of Make because it was a bit like using a net full of holes. Only certain things would be attended to. And if you are serious about value co-production, that value realization evolves through the individual trajectories in people's lives, you have to have more of a harpoon to be able to follow them. So yes, we overlaid the net with a harpoon. And yeah, there are different ways of implementing outcome mapping approach. One is very labor intensive, relying on multiple workshops. We have not done that. We experimented with journals, participation journals, but in the end, we started to rely very heavily on stories and narratives. We commissioned local residents to give us their stories, and I think narratives are very, very interesting tool and in fact an approach to understanding change in complex systems. But I know that there are other panelists who are interested in narratives, so maybe I'll stop now.
Well, let's ask them. Let's ask our fellow panelists if they have any remarks. I noticed that you talked about Make being underpinned by latency rather than efficiency, and I wondered if that resonated with Kim's remark about being interested in longitudinal relationships rather than outcomes per se. But I'm interested if any of our panelists want to respond in any way here.
Hello. Thanks, Patricia. That was really interesting. And I think there is a lot between Take Apart and Make that is quite similar in approaches. And yeah, that's interesting, that longitudinal piece of work, because that's how we work. And often when funders are asking us for our data, it's quite hard within a 1-year period of time to show that quite deep and meaningful change within people and communities. And I struggle myself, and I will talk about that in my presentation, with funders and how we present short-term data in regards to community-based placemaking. So I don't know if you have any tips or tricks for me.
If the question is for me, I don't know if I have tricks as such. My background is in the humanities, and this leads me to observe that people respond differently to spreadsheets and very differently to stories and pictures. And when I worked in policy research, I was told that it's the civil servants who are very attentive to spreadsheets and the kind of numbers of people, bums on seats, but it's the ministers who pay attention to pictures. So I think the combination of both is needed, and in fact, it's really about weaving it coherently. That I think presents a persuasive account. I don't think there are many tricks here, really.
Well, let's find out if others have tricks too in the discussion to come. I want us to move on though to hear from Tessie. Tessie, you're going to tell us about your experience of evaluating placemaking.
Great, thanks so much. I'll just share my slides. 1 second. Great, so it's a very short time to talk, and this is my favorite subject, so I'm going to have to really hone in on specific things relevant to this conversation. And I guess I'm sort of quite excited to share the journey that we've taken developing the outcomes framework that we're working to, and also to sort of show the story of how it's been iterated and built with research from residents' experience. So it's been developed. I think we're on a number of versions. I think we're on version 3 or 4 now. But this has been developed over a number of years and through activity. So I was just really excited to kind of share some of the insights of that story, because it's something which I'm really passionate about, is actually measuring things which can actually sort of change our lives, but you know, doing it with residents all the way through, really. So just to give you a little bit of context, the project that we're currently working on is called Everyone Every Day, and it's an amazing, joyful, but currently rather closed project in Barking and Dagenham. These are some pictures from our spaces, some of the activity that happens. It's an incredibly exciting project where we're trying to see if we can gather the tools and infrastructures we need to take practical participation in everyday activity to scale, and to see if that's even possible. And so see if it's possible, but then actually measure it to say what is the actual potential of this. So measuring the outcomes and figuring out how outcomes are created has been a really key component of the work. And it's in Barking and Dagenham in East London, which is one of the poorest boroughs in London. And it experienced deprivation on almost every single indicator across London. I think there are 32 boroughs, and nearly all the indicators are Barking and Dagenham is sort of 29, 28, 30. So it's a very challenging place to work, particularly in this kind of work. So we've been here three and a half years, and we've got neighborhood shops. There's a sort of set infrastructure, physical infrastructure that we've built, which is kind of, we think of it in platform terms. I really appreciated what Patricia said on a number of things. One is, how do you describe the project? Because you can describe it about 20 different ways, depending on who you're talking to. You can understand it in lots of different ways. But also that it's not actually the same as a project, and it comes with a lot more complexity than a project where you're trying to build systems with lots and lots of things having to work together to create this kind of participation, this kind of activity. So we have a large maker space in the south of the borough, and we have neighbourhood project shops. We have 5 of those across the borough. We are also working at sort of street level, trying to create sort of mini platforms of projects and activities. So we're working with about 64 different streets at the moment. So really trying to distribute practical everyday activity into as close to where people live as possible. And so this is just another example where we've versioned it. We've got a support platform, which is our team, network of shops, operations, logistics, insurance, all those sorts of things. We have a co-creation, co-production process that we work with residents, where we're creating a participation ecosystem, which is activities and networks and collaborative businesses and so on. And just to show that over the years, it's a sort of we're trying to understand it better. And we're building new infrastructures all the time to create all these different kinds of plug-in points. So we've got a new collaborative cooperative. I forgot to start my timer, by the way, which isn't helpful, is it? Okay.
You're fine, don't worry.
I haven't even started my story. That's the problem. So this is kind of where we're at the moment, and I haven't got time to go into detail. So just to say that we started this work sort of 11 years ago, and sort of did it step by step, smaller and larger prototypes as we went along. And before we came to Barking and Dagenham with this larger scale project, we did a project in West Norwood, in South London, and over 12 months we started 20 projects, and we were fortunate enough to have some resourcing. We did some in-depth interviews with about 100 people, and we asked them what the impact of participating in small scale, sometimes for an hour, sometimes 2 hours, practical activity with their neighbours, what kind of impacts they thought it was. So we started with a very open question. And from that, we've built the sort of the next iteration of questions. But essentially what people said to us really was that this kind of activity was great, but there needed to be much more of it. It needed to be more widespread. It needed to be more geographically spread. There needed to be more diversity of opportunities. Basically, residents just said we need a whole lot more, because how impacts will work with this is that it needs to add up. So there's no point in trying to kind of figure out what one thing does. You need to see what it does over time. This is repeat participation. This is how these kind of impacts are work. At the same time, they also told us that that when they were in the room, there were actually direct and immediate impacts. The actual experience of being in the space, doing things with people, were actually already creating impact for them. So what they were really saying was that there are direct and immediate impacts, but that they need to add up over time. So what we came out of that project realizing is that we did need to actually take it to a whole new level, really, that we did need to make it part of everyday life, that it couldn't be just for extraordinary heroic people. It couldn't just be one-offs. It couldn't be once a month. There needed to be loads and loads of opportunities so that everybody that lives in a neighborhood could find a way of plugging into that. And that was really one of the central ways that we discovered that we could make it inclusive, because a lot of the participation that we create at neighborhood level at the moment is really designed around people that have a lot of confidence, that have a lot of time. And we wanted to create something which would actually be good for everybody, that those benefits of being together, doing things in the spaces and doing this practical activity would actually benefit everybody. So we needed to find a way that that sort of built an ecosystem of opportunities, that if you had 2 jobs, if you had health issues, if you had children to raise or family to look after, you could still find a way of plugging in through your interests, through the time available, through the benefits you were experiencing. And so one of those sort of initial things was we had to go to scale. And we started, this was sort of what we came out with. This bottom bit is the kind of the platform creates the projects create the participation. And so what we came out of that initial project was that we realized that there were direct effects. Those are the direct and immediate effects. There'd be collective effects, so the effects of lots of people doing small things. So those were a lot to do with environmental impacts and things like that. And then there were the networked effects. And everything past the sort of red curve at the bottom where it says direct effects, collective and networked effects, everything else we extrapolated. So we were kind of thinking about, in sort of using abductive reasoning, what if this is the case, what could these things look like? And how could they add up over time? And so very briefly, this is what it kind of looks like. We realized that there could be single outcomes, but that they could also be compound outcomes. So some of this stuff could really transform people's lives and neighborhoods and outcomes as a result of that. So that was kind of the outcomes framework. And then when we've been doing the Barking Dagenham, we did 2 years worth of growing. So we've got 6,000 residents that we've been working with across the borough, and we did another set of in-depth interviews. And this time we had a much longer data set. So we had 2 years worth of participation. We had a much broader range of people that we were interviewing that had been participating in many different ways. And they actually, we've completely changed this, we versioned this outcomes framework, because what they told us really was that this was common across so many people. And we transcribed all the interviews, we coded them. There were umpteen codes. I can't even begin to tell you how many codes we had, But essentially what people were telling us was that this was a sort of common journey across many of them, that they had to feel welcome in the spaces, they felt included and accepted, they started making friends, building trust, they became more active, they engaged in learning and feeling excited about being creative, they're growing in confidence and capability. And actually what that sort of, all of this told us about feeling happy and optimistic was this sort of added up to them feeling a new sense of capability, a new sense of agency. So what our new outcomes framework looks at, and this, I mean, we're probably about 10 versions away from really doing it, but step by step, I think where we've got to here is that the direct immediate effects add up to the sort of individual agency. And what we've done as a result of these interviews is really sort of divide these collective impact indicators into these different areas. And this version shows you 7, but we're working on one which is that we're adding an 8th one to that at the moment. But we think that over time we'll be able to sort of measure how those collective effects get made, and what are the compound elements which sort of marry the collective agency and the individual agency. And also we've sort of added, every time we kind of do this analysis and this research, we add to the inclusivity principle. So we had 14 before we did this piece of research. And of course, what's been so amazing in Barking Dagenham is that so many children have been involved, and it's been absolutely phenomenal. We've had over 1,000 children involved. And what it's meant by making so many children welcome is that it's enabled the parents to attend. And actually we realized how many things there were that parents couldn't attend because children weren't welcome. So on the one hand, it's added to the inclusivity of the parents, but actually they've become really co-producers of this project. You know, they look after chickens, they sweep and vacuum the shops, they deliver newspapers, they welcome people into the space. And so it's kind of extraordinary to think about how children are impacted through this project. And I feel like we're only at the beginning stages of really understanding how over time these impacts actually add up for people to be, you know, self-employed or employed, to find new livelihoods, to have really happy childhoods in their neighborhood, making places good places to grow up. So I think that we're just at these really, really early stages. It's only been 10 years, 11 years. It'll be another 11 years before we could really understand it. And I do think that we will reach a point with this where we'll think we've done enough to prove that this stuff is happening. And we will need to get to a point where we stop investing as much resource as we do into impact, but we're not quite there yet, I don't think. Did I have another try? Okay, this is my last slide, and then I'm going to shush. Just to let you know that these are the impact surveys. You probably can't read it. I can't even read it. But essentially, what we've done is when people participated in any activity, we asked them to tell us what do an impact survey as they left the space, which was obviously made us terribly popular. But we've got a consistent now sample of about 600 people. And this impact survey was created from that first round of interviews where people were saying, you know, creativity, feeling more confident, feeling a sense of community and creativity, whether they were learning something or teaching something. These were things that people said were the results of this. The thing that I wanted to highlight, which is still the most striking to me, is that how many new people did you talk to at today's activity, which is, you know, ranges from, you know, some people were talking to more than 10 people. And then how many people did you talk to of a different ages or from different cultures and backgrounds during today's session? And again, just crazy numbers of people. I think the average is 7 people at any event that they spoke to someone they had never met before. So it's really highlighted how much this is sort of, this practical participation was actually not just talking about cohesion and mutual understanding and cultural trust and all those sorts of things. It was actually doing it in real time. So that's another thing which has been really exciting for us. But like I said, this has been consistent, by the way, these results over a period of 2 years. So the numbers on these impact surveys don't vary very much as the numbers increase. So I think we're up to 600 or 700 people at the moment. And that's me. That's me done. That's all I've got time for. Is that right?
Thank you so much, Tessie. That was really full, and I love the idea that children cleaning up after chickens is a metric of evaluation for you. How delightful. But I want to ask you, I mean, I'm struck by listening to you that how sensitive you are to your participants, that they are the people who are evaluating in a sense. And I wonder whether there is I wonder for all of you actually, who is evaluation for, and is there a trade-off between your different constituencies, you know, the participants, the funders, your organization, yourself? Perhaps you can have a go at that, Tessie, and I'll invite the others to come in too.
I mean, I think one of the things that we think is really important is that only the people can self-evaluate, and sometimes that's been through these very sort of clunky, very immediate numeric surveys when they leave, just to get some quantitative data. But it's also when they do the stories, we encourage them to sort of do almost development evaluation on their own experience. And we think that that's really important because we're drawing them into a big design process. This research is actually designing the next iteration of things, and what they say will actually change the practice for us. So we think it's the only real way of doing that. We have a very complex set of funders and partners, and if they're commercial funders or commercial organizations, or like developers, for example, who we're working with, they all look for different metrics. And I think one of the things which has been wonderful is that all our funders for the first 5 years of this research project have agreed to the same set of metrics, and that's made a huge difference.
I imagine that's enormously helpful, isn't it? I wonder if I can ask the others to come in here about this question of who evaluates, whether you've had to make trade-offs between the various constituents who are parts of your project. Bethany, Katrina, Kim, or Patrizia?
I could perhaps make a small contribution by way of an example I had of a conversation between myself at the park with my park hat on and a cultural theatre centre in Havant called the Spring Centre. We're basically working on a theatre festival to take place at the park in August. And whilst we were talking about, you know, who's going to pay for the generator, who's going to sort the catering, the last thing we discussed was how are we going to evaluate? And we then actually had to make a really interesting arrangement in that we've got this physical context of tent, and basically they're arts council funded and we're lottery funded, so we have different objectives. So as partners in this project, we have to make sure that we can both get what we need out of it. And it took a bit of negotiation, but I think we finally sort of settled on a way forward in that everyone in the tent gets evaluated by the Arts Council and everyone outside the tent gets evaluated by the lottery. So we'll still have to work on how exactly that will work, but it's been really interesting in creating partnerships with different people who are using the park as a platform to deliver services. You know, we're working with Mind, we're working with a group called Get Up and Go, which is about activities for the over 55s, and how do we then share our, you know, shared interests through evaluation. And it often and anon it's just about having a conversation to work out how we can sort out the privacy policy.
This sounds so complicated. We're going to run out of time, so I'm going to move us along. But I'm going to encourage our panelists, if they wanted to add further comments, you can put it in the chat because I know our audience are following that too. Let's get Bethany and Katrina in first. You're going to talk us through your work together. Bethany, I think you're starting, aren't you?
Yeah, and I deliberately didn't respond to that question because my talk kind of touches on some of those issues. So I didn't want to kind of give it away, if you like. Yeah, I'm going to speak for about 5 minutes and then Katrina's going to do the same because I'll be talking primarily about one particular piece of research that we did together, whereas Katrina will be talking about her different job roles and experiences in relation to that. So that's how we're going to structure it. Let me just share my screen. Yeah, so just to say, my background is in museum studies. Yeah, during my PhD, I became interested in what occurs behind the scenes of museums and other cultural institutions, and what work in these spaces actually looks like, and why that is. So I'm quite interested in the kind of forces, I guess, that inform what people do in their jobs. So this interest in kind of organizational work and practices informed the research that I'll be talking about today. So I'm going to use the time to just share some findings and key learnings from a piece of research conducted with Katrina Foxton last year. So the quotes that I'll be sharing in the next couple of slides come from interviews and workshops conducted for this research online because of the pandemic, but in Leicester, Grimsby and Bristol last year between March and June. So the research was focused actually on community organisations taking over buildings from local councils. And we just wanted to understand a bit more about the work they do and why, and the challenges that they face. So the research wasn't really about evaluation, but just through talking to people and in the workshops, it was really plain to us that evaluation was a really core part of their work, and really kind of impacted on them in lots of interesting ways. So I guess my talk is a kind of evaluation of evaluation practices. Okay. So I've decided to kind of frame the talk as just key learnings from the research in relation to evaluation. So first, as I think that has come through a little bit in the other talks, and this might be quite obvious to anyone who is tasked with evaluating, evaluation is not neutral or a benign practice. Actually, it can have quite harmful effects, I would argue. I think it has effects on everyday working practices, and I think it can actually exclude individuals and organisations from funding. This is obviously a really complex point, so I'm making it quite quickly, and I hope that maybe we can pick up some of this in the discussion. But the exclusionary impact of evaluation, I think, is encapsulated quite nicely in this story from an interview I did with the CEO of quite a kind of large and, I guess, successful youth work charity in Bristol, and I'll just read it out in full. So they said, "I think there's a professionalisation of the charity sector, which is both a good thing in that we're measuring more, we can prove what we achieve, and it helps us to refine what we do and all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, it starts to exclude those people with lived experience. A classic example is another youth work organisation in Bristol. We offered them, because they're deeply embedded in their community, we offered them 20 grand a year as part of a contract that we'd won to work with young people, but it involved measuring outcomes. Not from our point of view particularly onerous, but they said, no, we don't want it. I think it was a mistake on their part, and I think it was because they didn't understand that it's just 20 minutes after each session, just scoring a few things. It's not a kind of deep database or anything, but I think they got scared and thought, sorry, I've just realised, can you actually not see this slide because I've moved the Zoom call?
I can see it, Bethany. Yeah.
Oh, weird. Sorry. That's very confusing.
I think you got to and thought it was.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I'll just start that bit again. So not from our point of view particularly onerous, but they said, no, we don't want it. I think it was a mistake on their part, and I think it was because they didn't understand that it's just 20 minutes after each session just scoring a few things. It's not a deep database or anything. But I think they got scared and thought didn't feel it was morally right, and therefore turned down the money. So I think there's much more that could be said here, particularly around the moral reasons why the organisation being spoken about might not want to sign up to a contract involving measuring outcomes. But I think the issue of exclusion is quite plain to see. The decision not to be part of the contract has real material effects on organisations working in these contexts, and creates a two-tier system within the voluntary and community sector between those organisations who are willing and able to meet the demands of standardised evaluation models and those who aren't or might choose not to. So moving on to my second point, I think what I found really interesting in our sample was the way practitioners talked about mitigating the effects of evaluation. So actually having to kind of manage the demands of evaluation. And I think that's come through in a couple of the talks already. So we heard how practitioners have developed skills in managing the evaluation process, And I think that really raises questions for me about whether evaluation does more harm than good, or how productive or generative it is. So this story is from a community development worker from a gardening project in Grimsby, and I think it illustrates this issue. So obtaining the funding and evaluation of that funding required this individual to gather transformative anecdotes from people who came to garden, a practice which for her went against what people themselves had identified as important about the atmosphere of the space and why they were comfortable attending. So she said, actually, we have done lots of consultation with our current volunteers in the last 12 months. And that is exactly what they said. Why they come to us is because, you know, the guy who comes who has got MS, who used to be a plumber and now can't work, he likes the fact that he's not treated as the guy with MS. He's just Brad that comes to do the potting on. He comes on Thursday and he pots on and he has his dinner and he has a cuppa with the other lads. He becomes one of the lads rather than the guy who can't work anymore because he's poorly. And that's what they like about the project. But trying to explain that, she's referring to funders, and trying to, other than getting case studies, and even then, I don't want to be saying to him, as a case study, can I say that you used to be a plumber, that you got MS and now you don't work? And he'll say, no, not really, I'd rather you didn't. So this is just one of the examples in the data of how the demands of funders and evaluation are seen to be a thing for practitioners to negotiate and manage, rather than as having any sort of productive role in developing the organisation. So just as a final point, and hopefully we can come back to this because I did these arrows and I wasn't quite happy with them, but thinking about how we might change current approaches to evaluation, I think requires us to understand a bit more about accountability relationships between organisations and funders, but also between funders and those who fund them, and then beyond that, the government departments and public bodies who distribute the funding. I think that, you know, sometimes we can forget that funders are subject to evaluation too, and they themselves might be experiencing cuts and job losses, which has consequences for their ability to innovate or to explore some of the non-standard approaches to evaluation that Tessie and Patricia have spoken about already. So I hope that was a useful kind of summary of my thoughts on evaluating evaluation. I know that it was super, super quick, but yeah, hopefully we can return to some of the points in the discussion.
Yeah, it was packed, and I think really illuminating to hear your critical perspective. I'm going to move us on to Katrina and then ask the questions to the two of you, because you have some shared interests. Thank you so much, Bethany.
Hello, everyone. I think I'm just waiting for my slides. Okay, if you're ready, I'm just going to talk briefly about my research interests. And just to say, this is a great opportunity to explore different ideas that I've been mulling over as a researcher, as a co-author of the Locally Rooted project with Bethany, and also as a professional in the heritage sector. So my research interests after completing my PhD in New York, and this work actually led towards me thinking about placemaking as a complex and messy meeting between people's evolving values and the experience of being in physical spaces. I'm also interested in the impact localism policy has on community management of places, so as to be aware of the ethical consequences of the shift of responsibility from local governments and authorities to communities, and interests that I share with Bethany. I won't talk about my professional background, that'll come up in a bit, but I'm very interested in the evaluation of placemaking and whether or how this could appropriately include critical attention about the role of place. So thank you, Lynn, if you could do the next slide for me. So a quick look into my PhD research, which focused on several heritage community asset transfer case studies. And you can see in my slide this example of the Red Tower, which is situated in one of the less affluent areas in York. And here, with these pictures, I was studying the layering of place over time surrounding the asset that was transferred to a community group in 2016. Shout out to Imelda, who's in the crowd somewhere. Through this desk-based analysis partnered with ethnography, I developed a theory on place which helped me understand how civic action, in this case, communities aiming for transfer of this asset as a way to take ownership and enhance the places, which is propelled by certain values, can be supported to an extent, and how far is up for discussion, by the tangible elements of place. By the tangible elements of place, I mean the infrastructure which can create an essence of place, so thoroughfares and spaces that can allow for the visibility of discussion, so benches, just little corners where people congregate, and also existing assets or centres of participation, such as libraries, community halls, etc. Such spaces allow for these further discussions to be held and actions to take place. So my theory also has an archaeological twist, because these spaces and assets have been sculpted by centuries of particular kinds of planning, usually by particular sorts of authorities, and can lead to the long-term creation of residual demographic patterns ranging from negative to positive. And physical place is perhaps one of the elements that can impact the success of community asset transfers. And we have seen in recent research, Archer and Wilson 2019, that areas of low affluence and high deprivation have less successful CAPs. Next slide, please. Moving to my work with Bethany on the Locally Rooted project, the question about how far place and the physical assets make a difference to the success of businesses working from transferred assets came up with varying answers. In our workshops, Bethany and I asked the participants who ran community businesses, what do their assets mean for them? And Lynn, if you could click once just to let the first quote up. I've chosen these two quotes to highlight very different emphasis or prioritization on the physicality of the asset. Just let you read that. And if you can click twice again now, Lynn. This varying emphasis that you can see was also evident in our discussions on wider place. And the next slide, please, Lynn. So essentially, when community businesses showed fidelity to local areas, i.e. they were locally rooted, we also saw efforts that they were not always loyal to one remit of place. These maps here indicate, as drawn by the participants, whilst they may begin from one area, they often expand to support the needs of communities of interest or different values. So they also reported the fact that they needed to change their remits in order to satisfy different funders' criteria. I'm happy to talk more about that in the later discussion. Wrapping up my bit for the last slide, please, Lynn. I'm now at this country park. I'm actually in one of the wonderful offices in the Victorian coach house. And in the last 3 years, this site has had 3.85 million put into the park's infrastructure. An anecdotal note by one of the rangers I work with is that since completing the restorations, there's been a 90% reduction in antisocial behaviour, which is quite a big deal for this area. It's in an area of low affluence, high deprivation. We've suffered from vandalism throughout the project. But I've even had recently a local student during an interview articulate very eloquently that how making a change to the park will improve the overall impression of the area and make it a nicer place to live, which happens to be one of my one of my lottery objectives that I have to sort of show and exemplify. So I sense that this brings us back to physical place having a direct impact upon civic life and the changing values of proximate communities. Evidently, what I'm putting forward requires more research, but considering our conversations today, I'm curious as to whether this question of the role of place and its ambiguities can be captured within evaluations. I suppose the concern here is that certain evaluations can potentially oversimplify rather than allowing for the telling of complex, messy stories or narratives, which I think is the word that comes up a lot, about history, people, and what propels them towards change. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Katrina. I'm going to come back to Bethany's question in a moment and open up to the audience and to our panelists. But just a specific question for you, Katrina, about, I wonder whether you're saying that, thinking about that quotation, about the locality being so central to an identity and the purpose of a building to serve the community rather than the other way around. And I wonder whether that you're saying that evaluation has to have local specificity, and whether that is, if that has implications, as in you can't have a pro forma template for evaluation. Evaluation is actually labor intensive when it has to be sensitive to locality.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that me and Bethany were trying to put forward in our locally rooted project at the end was that we were calling funders to make more of an effort in terms of reaching out to their communities and understanding their localities and their needs. And there was a recently, I think, some work by the Local Trust and Big Local project, which did actually show how they made changes to the remit of these community groups they were working with, which we felt was a really positive step in the right direction.
And that means it is a labour-intensive project, isn't it, when you have to tailor
Yes.
evaluation in that way? So you
Yeah.
have to find ways to build that into your planning.
Did we call it elasticity or something, Bethany? I think something like that. We wanted an elastic approach to evaluation.
Yeah, definitely. But I think what we noticed, and I think when you do research like this, and you get a really good quote, it can be really too easy to just like hone in on that, and then forget some of the other more maybe slightly sort of less well articulated points that were made. Because whilst we definitely did hear about people that had been in the kind of third sector space, I guess, for a long time, who were able to speak back to the funders and argue for a more locally specific approach. That definitely wasn't always the case. There were other people who were very new to this type of activity, and that's becoming increasingly the case as obviously like the state kind of steps away from responsibility. And I think that for those people who are really new and do really need money, so they're quite dependent on some of the funders. So they don't want to rock the boat, and they don't necessarily have the confidence to do that or the language to do so. And I guess that's why it was really important to us to try and build in time for those sort of less experienced people to come into contact with people that have been in the game a long time, to kind of share some of those trade secrets, I guess.
Thank you. Let me put your provocation, as it were, I think, Bethany, to the rest of our panelists. Are there circumstances where evaluation seems to be doing more harm than good? I wonder what our other panelists.
I'm happy to respond. I guess one of the things I was struck by all the other speakers is that firstly, obviously, that evaluation can be onerous on participants and on organizations. But I guess the thing which I most worry about is that sometimes participants can be used, and that's the thing that I'm most wary of, particularly when we're asked to produce photos of happy, smiling people doing things. It feels like we're using them not to enrich the research or engage in our understanding, but almost to sell to people. And so I'm just really cautious about how we use that. And I think you both mentioned, Patricia, you mentioned that some people like photographs and other people like metrics, but actually, and you were talking, Bethany, about a really good quote. I mean, I think we all fall into it, or we're sort of compelled to fall into it, but it does worry me a lot. And I try and resist it as much as possible, that we're not using our participants as a way of selling or getting further funding or whatever.
I too am happy to come in briefly on the harmful effect of evaluation, because I do think there are many, and evaluation is a very powerful format tool that should be used with care. There will be a series of working papers that underpinned the Make Evaluation report, where I look at what evaluation does, who controls it, and whether more good than bad comes out of it. And I mean, effectively, the thing is that even before we look at the content of any evaluation report says, the very fact that evaluation is being done can dramatically change the perception of the project. It's a legitimizing tool, if you like, right? So there's this amazing scholar in the US who talks about creep and accretion in evaluation, just to illustrate that rather than any rational dissemination of knowledge, evaluation just gets out of the hand as soon as the decision to do it is made. So even before we start talking about the dynamic of power within individual projects, even the very decision to evaluate should not be taken lightly, I think.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we want to try and squeeze in some audience questions, so I'm going to come to Kim, who's going to talk to us about her experience of evaluating and placemaking.
Hi, everyone. My organization is Take Apart, and I'm going to talk today about our very organic and iterative approach to evaluation with our community group. We're based in the Efford area of Plymouth, where we grew up, although we have projects that are now national and international. The area was the first to be built post Second World War. At the time, it was called the White City. It had indoor plumbing, there were lots of facilities, and of course, people in Plymouth at that time had jobs. There was a disinvestment in the dockyards in the 70s and 80s, and deprivation started to seep in. By 2005, the Efford community was the 5th most deprived area of the city, and as such, it kind of limped along. It wasn't deprived enough for the council to be able to prioritize it. But thankfully, in 2006, they were awarded funding for master planning from the central government. And the urbanist and architect Shillam Smith, who were involved in that planning, said, I know what you need to do. You need to involve artists in this master planning because they will bring more people to the conversation and you'll get more out of it. And so we did. So we started with a series of very small pilot projects, taking an idea that if you have a town hall style meeting, you'll have potentially older members of the public coming. But if you have projects that are outside in the public realm, more people will attend. So this is an example about road safety. We did some street dancing. Families and children came, and we could ask a lot more questions about what was wanted and what was needed. So we really started just kind of testing some things, and we realized what we were doing was taking an asset-based community development approach, looking at what's strong in the area, not what's wrong, and focusing on the energies and the agencies and the people as experts. We brought all of them together into what we like to call an arts action group model of working. So this is where community members, agencies, and arts organizations and local authorities are all in the room at the same time, so we can unlock potential and move forward projects much more rapidly than if there was one centralized project worker, for example, going and having all of these different conversations. What this group did then as well, they were responsible for setting agendas. So this group here are asked, what would you like to do? And then we go and do it. So they are writing the funding applications. They are setting the evaluative framework. They're producing the work. They're marketing the work locally. And then they're doing it again and again and again, constantly testing and testing their approaches and tweaking slightly as they go. We use Einstein's ladder of community empowerment as a litmus test for all of the work that we do. So we're trying to move away from a more non-participatory and manipulative approach to a citizen control, which is a utopian, obviously, value, but as much as possible, placing community members as the experts. And very quickly in the process with the Efford community, there were 5 targets that came out of that process. They wanted to do more work with young people, so to support young people, community cohesion, educational attainment and skills development, employability, and making changes to the physical nature of the community. So it was an evaluative framework that was set by the community. We do lots of projects that are around exploring identity and celebrating it while also learning skills. So learning how to make film, for example, learning how to stone carve. We present all of that work right back to the community. So they're always seeing the results quite rapidly and quite often. We're quite celebratory in the work that we do. We also go and see other projects so that we can magpie opportunities and make more changes in the local area and raise ambitions for the community. We then also amplify the work that we're doing, giving more agency and more voice to a community which was called Little Beirut in Efford. It was a no-go zone of the city. And so changing those narratives is really important to the community members as well. We also celebrate very often. So this is Maria, and she makes a lot of bread for community projects. So Michael is giving her an award for all of her good service. So we're supporting people to kind of have a role, if you will, in their community and be acknowledged for that. And we're also supporting people to develop social enterprises. So this is Jace, and he volunteered with us for many years on a community allotment project, and he has taken that over and employs himself now 26 hours a week in the community to run it himself and teach other schools how to grow. The community got really quite bullshy as a result of all of this amplification. They felt that they were creative experts in the city, so they decided to call themselves the capital of culture for Plymouth. They marched down to the city centre with a manifesto that they created, calling for more and better opportunities for communities to participate in social projects where they live. And the results have been pretty fantastic. So we've been able to, since 2009, work with 330,000 people in Plymouth. We've commissioned 47 artists on 30 commissions, most of them from Devon and Cornwall, because we want to support local employability. We've supported and initiated work with 8 communities, 8 schools, 30 exhibitions and sharebacks, 2 international symposia, an exhibition. We've created 5 social enterprises, and we've established 2 sister organizations, one in Carlow and one in Cheltenham, and recently founded the Social Art Network Southwest to develop opportunities for artists. I think it's really important to note that because of that Arts Action Group framework, in each of these communities and each of these projects, the evaluative pillars will be different, because we're asking people on a hyper-local level how and what they want to evaluate themselves. So that's me. I was speedy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I want to ask you about, I mean, it's so amazing to see that picture of the community marching with their placards, so invigorating, which is a kind of outcome in itself. And I wonder, your case seems to be that if we're not, it's important for you to not to be to predict the outcomes of a project. I mean, your outcomes are so various: symposia, exhibitions, social enterprises, educational initiatives. But if you aren't predicting outcomes, how do you go about evaluation then?
Yeah, it has been difficult. It's quite iterative, as I was saying. It's about going back to the community and testing again and again. And success, I mean, the community will not care about international symposia. I care about it, and the art world cares about it. And then other people might not care about social enterprise. So like a good outcome is a really difficult question to answer to. Sometimes it's just around doing something that feels good. Sometimes it's about doing something that's asked for. And sometimes it's also about doing something that is surprising. I'm not a researcher, I'm sure you can tell. I'm just doing the work on the ground in the community, and that's enough for me. That's my evaluation, is if people keep coming back, asking for more, doing it again. We have relationships going back 14 years now in communities where those groups are still going.
Kim, you're something more noble than an academic. You're a real practitioner. And it begs the question, which I want to ask all of our panelists: what counts as evidence in an evaluation? And how do we account for values that lie outside the remit of evaluation reports? Does anybody want to have a go at that question? What counts as evidence in an evaluation, and how do we account for values that lie beyond the remit of evaluation reports?
I'm happy to have a go.
Patrizia.
Because once again, if you take value co-production, co-creation seriously, there are no values outside of your report, precisely because you don't preempt what's in, what's out, and who is in and who is out. So one of the central things for Make, and a topic of one of the working papers, is how places are systems at the same time. Yes, sure, they are local, but they are also those evolving networks that cannot be contained. And the question of setting boundaries is critical, right? So stakeholders, frames, and boundaries. And every every evaluation will struggle with that because it cannot be indefinitely expanding, and yet this is only assuming that the objectives are being fixed, that you do not evolve in the model presupposed by the service dominant logic. So once again, I'm not evading your question, I don't think.
No, but you're not at all. But let me join Katrina and Bethany, who both have hands up.
Well, okay. Do you want me to go first? I'll just quickly say what's really interesting about this, or slightly ironic about this conversation, is that today at 2, I'm supposed to be meeting my evaluation consultant for the lottery project for the park. So I'll be able to bring all of the points that we've been discussing today to her and say, can we do it this way? Can we try and make a story? And I actually think she'll be quite open to that, because when she initially started working with us, she was saying she wanted to talk about the narrative of the project, and she was up for essentially co-producing with our audiences and the different people who we are working with at the park. So for instance, we're working with the Friends of Storm Country Park, and they're working on certain projects, and we'll probably have to do some kind of interview with them at some point. But the other one that just sort of brought to mind is when we were working with local students on the John Muir Award, and the question of what counts as evidence. We were aware that these students wouldn't want to necessarily write anything down, so we basically helped we encouraged them to see what they would like to do in terms of evaluation, and in the end they created a film that essentially was then posted out and shared, and that actually helped them get the certificate they need to achieve the John Muir Award. So it sort of it came back into their control. It came back into them gaining something from it.
Bethany, very quickly, so we can turn to the audience.
I mean, I probably can't make my point quickly because, to be honest, I don't really know what I was going to say. But it was just when someone said about hierarchies of evidence, I was like desperate to speak about it because it's, a pet topic of mine. But I think it's totally fascinating. And I think that one of the questions that I don't even know the answer to is that I think we just assume that we can put the numbers and the graphs together with the photos and the stories, and that creates kind of one truth about the value or the outcome. And yeah, I think that that's not the case. So yeah, that's all I've got to say on that.
Important, and we're so constrained for time, it's very difficult, I know, for you to get your remarks in, but do feel free to respond to the comments. I want to try and turn to the audience, and there have been a number of really fascinating questions. This is a question from Anna de Amicis. I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name. And this is a question from one of her research participants about new models of working with young people. If we test these at really small scale, prove that these work, how can we scale up these methods and share them around? So this is about scaling up your innovative evaluation methods. So have any of you had that experience or have any advice to share about that?
I think very briefly, because I think I posted a cursory reply in the chat because I'm trying to pay attention to what's happening right in front of me. But yes, scaling up is such an interesting issue, right? Because yes, places are situated, contextually embedded, and all of that, right? They are like unique and specific, and yet you ask, well, how can models be transferred? And my answer is that with methods, I think yes, they can be transferred and tested between places. With frameworks, not so much, just because frameworks are dependent on the systems considerations that I introduced. Yeah.
There's a question from Marcus Wilcox about how we normalize the. Oh, sorry, Katrina, did you want to come in? You waved at me. You're muted at the moment. Let me ask the question. If we can get you in, Katrina, we will. So this question about how we normalize the value of co-production in placemaking for all those involved in everyday construction and maintenance of physical places. This sounds like a question for Katrina, in fact, so that the co-production becomes a long-term feature in much more infrastructure and development rather than being treated as social or arts add-on. So how do we integrate the evaluation of placemaking?
I was really interested by Marcus's question as well, because my partner is the highways strategy and policy guy at Oxfordshire County Council, and so he deals every day with spreadsheets and the technicalities of roads. And I asked a question, you know, how do you think, what do you think about the work that I'm doing at the kitchen table? And basically sort of saying about how he has locality meetings with council members, and they basically, that's how they integrate. Essentially, that is the model. The technicality guys, the guys doing the physical infrastructure of place, are just talking to the councils. So that's the current only model. But it's really interesting that lately he's been sending me some research documents and reports that are created by accredited sort of stamp of approval by the council research units. I think the one that he mentioned to me was, it said it was APSE or ASP or something like that, and so I was sort of thinking, what is the way in? I can't answer the question because I think it's extremely long-term, ongoing problem, or a challenge rather. Yeah, that's what I'm getting to. But I've got a man on the inside, so work on that.
Let me ask one last question. This is from Ben Payne, and it's connected to a question that Anna asked slightly earlier. And Ben's question was about returning to your metaphors, Patrizia, of the net and the harpoon, where the net is a leaky way of gathering evidence and the harpoon is more targeted. And Ben's question is about what approaches or techniques to capturing stories have panelists seen or used in their work. And I know Anna asked earlier about using narratives earlier in the stage of social design rather than simply only in evaluation. So approaches or techniques to capturing stories and narratives.
So I have been now looking at the large body of literature in management, maybe surprising place, where for the last 30, 40 years, people have been using narrative approaches to understand what happens within organizations, right? And there are various. I mean, there are narrative interview techniques, but there are also just simple capture of stories that can be analyzed. This is a very well-established body of research as a methodological contribution from within the humanities. I think the problem we have is that somehow people still think about it as far too messy to deliver what people want out of evaluation. And what they want is effectively a means of decision making. They don't want to get plunged into the depth of interpretation. What they want is perhaps a little too simplistic. So I think the methods and techniques are there. The question is how to provide a translation to make them fit for a purpose to do the evaluating job.
Thank you. We've totally run out of time, of course. I'm going to ask one last question to each of you before we close. I think we should end on a positive note, and I wonder whether you can share one positive outcome that has come from doing an evaluation. Can anybody start?
For me, I think doing evaluation, especially in the approach that I take, just means that I'm ensuring everyone has a voice and feels held throughout the process.
Wonderful. Bethany, any thought?
Yeah, I guess slightly different as someone that ended up sort of evaluating evaluation a little bit. I think it was really positive in that when we wrote the draft of our report and sent it to the people who funded the research, who are a funder, you know, they came back to us and said, yeah, we know that this is a problem, and we are so open to having conversations with our grantees. You know, please let them know that we really want that. So I think there's an appetite to think through the impact of these practices, and I think that is really positive.
Tessie?
I think the thing that I get most excited about evaluation is using developmental evaluation as a design tool. So I think rather than waiting to the end and having it a measure of success or failure or just about value creation, I think evaluation on an ongoing basis, sometimes on a daily basis, actually helps to steer and enrich and make the work better. So I think as a design tool, I think it's fantastic.
Katrina?
yeah, I really like that point, Tessie. I've recently heard more of the same elsewhere in other research. But going back to what Bethany was saying about the appetite that funders have, I think I'd like to point out that actually the council that I work with has helped us write an evaluation survey for the lottery restorations. And one of the really interesting steps that they took was to very clearly and very sensitively frame the questions surrounding demographics, like, are you white British, what age are you, all of those really awkward questions that seem to be commonplace, but they made it very clear that those questions were optional to answer. And I think that something that somebody else I was talking to recently found it really empowering to A, know that it was optional, and B, to know exactly what they were looking for those answers for. Like, they actually explained why they were asking those questions. I think that's a really important step, a really positive step.
Patrizia, to end.
I'm proud. I like the relationships I developed through being part of the project, and indeed continuing these relationships now in a more developmental evaluation form, working with the same team of people, and also seeing how this group is really like layers of an onion and expanding. And I also learned new stuff. I understand new things. That was fun.
Isn't that what we all want? Wonderful. Thank you to Patricia Kaczynska, Tessie Britton, Bethany Rex, Katrina Foxton, and Kim Wide. Thanks also to our friends at the Social Design Institute, Lucy Kimball, Louise Ingledow, and Lynn Finn for organising this. There'll be more discussions from the Social Design Initiative, so look out for them soon. Goodbye from us. Goodbye.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Shahida.
much, Shahida, for chairing.
Thanks,
You're welcome.
everyone.
You're wonderful. Bye, everyone. Thanks for wonderful questions.